At the risk of further stoking further fears of World War III, here we go. In addition to what is happening between Ukraine and Russia, plus the weeks-long air campaign involving the United States and Iran, a confrontation between the United States and Russia is on the horizon, perhaps in just a couple of days. The battle site? The coast of Cuba, as a Russian oil tanker races toward the island. It was not too long ago that I warned of a potential Cuban tanker crisis in the making, and now here we are. So today, let's briefly review the Cuban conundrum before turning to the tanker at the heart of the current case, which will somehow involve Atlantis, the Air Bud rule, and my slow descension into madness. Okay, you will recall that this saga began on January 3rd, when the United States initiated the Special Maduro Operation, arresting the Venezuelan president. Yes, there was an era when the United States stuck to brief conflict timelines. Well, in the aftermath, the White House has de facto controlled Venezuelan foreign policy. Part of that has meant cutting off the subsidized crude oil that Maduro had previously sent to Cuba. And emboldened by that operation, Trump also declared an oil quarantine, against Cuba, threatening to impose tariffs on any country that tried. Just about everyone has complied, notably including Mexico, which had previously been Cuba's key partner. As it stands now, the last oil shipment to Cuba arrived on January 9th. Cuba needs about 100,000 barrels of oil per day to run properly. The island can only produce 40,000 barrels on its own, leaving a 60,000 barrel gap to fill. The end result is Cuba temporarily going dark, and a growing sense of desperation from the government. Cuba's main hope was to receive oil shipments from Russia. Just as Cuba is desperate for oil, the Kremlin is desperate to find buyers, or at least was desperate before the Iran war began. And the tariff threat to Russia was effectively meaningless. Almost all trade between Russia and the United States ceased at the start of the invasion of Ukraine. However, the White House did not plan to have the tariff threat be the only mechanism of enforcement. There are also a couple of U.S. Coast Guard cutters patrolling Cuba, presumably ready to intercept any unarmed tanker attempting to dock on the island. I will emphasize the unarmed part as foreshadowing for later. Now, there already has been some action with tankers attempting to reach Cuba. On February 5th, the Ocean Mariner departed Colombia with 84,000 barrels of oil, with a declared destination of the Dominican Republic. A week later, the tanker made a sudden movement toward Cuba. The U.S. Coast Guard interdicted, ensuring that the Ocean Mariner reached the Dominican Republic as declared. Round 2 also started in mid-February, when the Seahorse left Russia with 200,000 barrels of oil, sailing west across the Atlantic and evidently toward Cuba. However, for most of March, it sat idle in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, drifting without apparent purpose. On March 17th, it restarted movement toward the Caribbean, this time aiming southeast of Cuba, perhaps to one of many destinations along the island chain. Reports suggest it may be Trinidad and Tobago, though maybe it is Venezuela. To speculate on what may have happened here, a Chinese company owns the Seahorse. Thus, even though it was carrying Russian crude, a third country was implicitly involved. And unlike Russia, the United States has an enormous trade relationship with China. The company behind the Seahorse may have been politically pressured into halting its plan. It then idled in the Atlantic until it found a new buyer, which ended up being an unclear Caribbean country not called Cuba. These two cases were merely the undercard, though, and now we are fast approaching the main event. On March 9th, the Anatoly Kolodkin left Russia. Perhaps to troll everyone, it declared Atlantis, USA as its destination. Cuba is often linked to the mythical paradise of Atlantis, and perhaps the USA part plays into the notion that Trump would love to have the honor to take Cuba. Assuming that it does not pull a Seahorse and stop in the middle of the Atlantic, it could reach Cuba as early as March 23rd. On board the Anatoly Kolodkin are 730,000 barrels of crude oil. Cuba has idle oil refineries in the country that used to process the crude imports from Venezuela. As a result, this one tanker could buy Cuba 12 extra days of normal oil usage, remembering that the current gap is 60,000 barrels per day. Of course, the global context of this move is that it is happening concurrently with the Iran war. Oil prices surged and then have somewhat stabilized at elevated values, with West Texas Intermediate just below $100 per barrel. But who knows what it is at by the time you hear these words. Now, if there is a single economic indicator that determines U.S. public opinion, it is gas prices. Thus, the onus is on the Trump administration to keep them low. Not an easy task when the de facto shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz is constraining 20% of global production. And oil being a globalized commodity, it hardly matters if the United States purchases little oil from the region. One of the tricks that the Trump administration created was a waiver on some Russian oil exports. This would allow countries to import Russian oil free of sanctions threats from the United States. That, in turn, would free up some supply, thereby reining in prices at the cost of throwing the Kremlin an economic lifeline, or at least an economic lifeline through a bunch of complicated steps. You see, the waiver only applied to oil already in tankers, which is past the point of sale to Russian oil companies. Thus, the benefit to Russian tax authorities is an increase in the future sales price, because the next purchaser will have an expectation that this could happen again, even if the waiver explicitly says otherwise. If the Trump administration did it once, the Trump administration may very well do it again. I'm spending so much time discussing this because the United States also just extended the waiver to Iranian oil, creating bizarre headlines that give the impression that the United States has relaxed sanctions against a country that it is currently at war with. But the problem here is again more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Iran will not receive additional money from the sales that the waiver permits. However, it will alter buyers' future expectations and cause perverse effects there, assuming that any oil can get out of Hormuz at all, which is a problem that Russia does not have. Perhaps the thing I hate the most about the current era of political polarization is that it is difficult to have a conversation about the nuance of foreign policy. Sometimes the effect of a coercive measure is not as harmless as what an administration might tell you, while also not being as disastrous as the opposition claims. Point is, as I have said before, the waiver on Iranian oil is a parlor trick band-aid that will provide only short-term relief to global oil consumers, while helping an injured Iranian regime, albeit not helping as much as some of the public discourse suggests. With all of that weird stuff happening, you can understand why some weirdness would extend to Cuba. Most of the practical effects of the waiver were intended to open imports to India. Nonetheless, there was some speculation in Russia that the waiver implied that the United States would begin permitting oil imports to Cuba. After all, the official text did not mention anything about certain countries being exempted from the exemption. It was truly the Air Bud rule of oil sanctions in action. Oh, for those of you who did not have the pleasure of growing up in the more pleasant time known as the 90s, Air Bud was a movie featuring a dog who played on a middle school basketball team. How is this possible, you might ask? Well, the rulebook did not explicitly say that dogs cannot play basketball. See, it is a real thing, with a real Wikipedia page. And although this type of loophole sounds like it would be better suited as a plotline for professional wrestling, maybe we ought not to forget that the current US president is a WWE Hall of Famer. So Russia tried to make that play. Well, the Trump administration then issued an updated waiver to explicitly deny access to Cuba, including it with the likes of North Korea and Russian-occupied Ukraine. So here we are. Let me briefly comment on how silly that expectation was, because it completely misses the point of those waivers. As it stands now, Cuba is not getting any oil. This has the effect of increasing supply for the rest of the world, even if it is making now a really bad time to be living on the island. To suddenly open up Cuba would then expand global demand, pushing a price increase to consumers in the United States. But the entire purpose of this whole song and dance is to decrease consumer prices in the United States. In any case, the Trump administration is refusing to budge, and we now find ourselves barreling toward a showdown. Interestingly, Russia felt that it was worthwhile to give the Anatoly Kolodkin a naval escort through the English Channel. Not a bad idea given that Europe has a strong incentive to detain Shadow Fleet tankers. In fact, France detained a false-flagged Russian tanker yesterday. The higher oil prices are, the more money that this denies the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom's Navy monitored the Anatoly Kolotkin as it passed through the channel. No action, though. Not with the escort there, anyway. However, that escort separated from the Anatoly Kolotkin upon entering the Atlantic. It therefore appears that if the United States wants to stop the tanker, it can. No one from the U.S. Coast Guard will be hurt, presuming that Russia has not placed Marines on board. There is increasing chatter out of the Kremlin to start doing this, but it has only been talk so far. And if the Marines are on board, then why hasn't the Kremlin broadcast this to deter a U.S. intervention? On one hand, it seems that Russia showed its hand by withdrawing the escort before getting anywhere near the Americas. Moscow has no ability to project power that far, especially when most of its bandwidth vanishes over the fields of Ukraine. Plus, there is the whole Monroe Doctrine thing. Given that, clearly the United States will board the Anatoly Kolotkin if it tries to reach Cuba. If the Cuban government receives that lifeline, it will receive many more such lifelines afterward. The last 2 months of what is definitely a quarantine and definitely not a blockade will then be for nothing. Internalizing the inevitability of the Anatoly Kolotkin's detainment, the Kremlin will therefore instruct its captain to find another location to drop the oil. Yet, at least for now, the tanker persists. Well, on the other hand, one thing to recognize is that the Iran war has opened up a new vulnerability for the United States. The Kremlin no longer needs to send its regards across an ocean. It only needs to ship some aid to Iran's way. Now, actually doing that is easier said than done, and threats are only as useful as the credibility of the potential follow-through. It is not like Russia has huge slack in its weapons manufacturing sector. Rather, the main realms that Russia has provided assistance to Iran are with intelligence and targeting. And presumably, if Russia wants to effectively threaten the United States, it would have to push for deeper cooperation on those fronts. The reason for this is economies of scale. It is incredibly expensive to set up an intelligence network, both on the ground and in orbit. But once established, it is very cheap to share what you know. Indeed, you will note that the United States has continued to give Ukraine the same assistance, despite the Trump administration withdrawing physical aid. It is the same principle at work. Still, on the margins, Russia could threaten to increase intelligence sharing. More than that, Russia has modified the design of the Shahed since Iran originally sold the license. I am sure that Iran would like to get access to the improvements, particularly with AI targeting systems. These threats would be a lot easier to follow through on than, say, nuclear annihilation. As a result, this may be a crisis in Cuba, but it does not have the same immediate nuclear undertones that the Cuban Missile Crisis had. I would be very concerned if I were the current leader of Cuba. I am not personally so concerned that I am currently digging a fallout shelter. Zooming out, if this were a basic bargaining problem, then it would have a basic solution. Russia wants to sell oil to Cuba. The United States does not want Iran to have Russian intelligence. So, make the trade, and both are better off. Their coalition partners might be worse off, but the United States and Russia are better off. Well, bargaining here is not so simple. When we discuss the efficiency of negotiated settlements, I often take for granted the verifiability of the deal. That is a low bar when the main good in dispute is territory. You can physically observe whether Russia has crossed the literal line or not, for example. Unfortunately, we cannot say the same about intelligence assistance. It is all hearsay, including the current accusations. Hearsay that I believe, but hearsay nonetheless. And whenever the Kremlin violates the agreement, there will be a delay between the violation and the US intel community's recognition of it. Now, it is possible to contract around this observability problem, but it would require having a patient Kremlin with a lot to lose. That would mean the Kremlin faces a substantial punishment for cheating and cares about the long-term consequences. I do not know about you, but the Kremlin from the last few years that I'm familiar with is impatient and has almost nothing to lose. That is why we have been here before, only to also go nowhere. The Kremlin has floated a similar swap, promising to drop assistance to Iran in exchange for the United States dropping assistance to Ukraine. Same observability problem, same lack of a credible bargain. So, to wrap up here, I do not know how this showdown will end. If I knew for sure, then both parties would also know for sure, and we would not be in a position where one side is trying to deny access to Cuba, while the other side has progressed 3/4 of the way to calling a bluff. What I do know is that this is a high-leverage situation that is not receiving the appropriate amount of media attention. It seems that 2026 has no plans to give us a breather. So take a look at one of these many other fun videos while I give myself 24 hours to recover. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.